Start recording. Hello, everyone. My name is Oscar Westler. I'm a professor at OsloMet, and it's with great honor Tina and I, also present here as a co-research leader, and many of our colleagues coming into the session. Welcome Claudia Mellado from Pontificia Universidad Católica de Valparaíso in Chile. And she will present some gems from her long-going research into role performance and the intersection with journalism and social media. And she has promised us sort of to give an overview into some of the ongoing projects. I know she has many publications recently with scholars such as Alfred Hamida and others, and many more publications in the works. And Claudia also would like us to have a discussion towards the end in how to further expand on this research agenda. So any comments of yours that can help sort of stimulate or inspire, or things that you can pick on in your own research? Claudia leads international networks, doing research in multiple countries in a very impressive way. So this is a good way to connect. For those of you who haven't participated before, what we typically do is to have a presentation of around 40 minutes, and then we have a discussion towards the end. And please write your comments or questions in the chat, and then we'll try to go through them by order of appearance so you can sort of feed into the discussion. With that said, great honor to have you here, Claudia. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me today on this online focus seminar series organized by, this is long, OsloMet Digital Journalism Research Group. Oscar and his colleagues have done, I think, amazing work on this. I have been present on different other seminars this year, yes. And I'm delighted to be here and share with you some of my research on journalism and digital media. Today, I would like to talk to you about a topic that fascinates me, which is journalistic identity and role performance, particularly in social media platforms. Especially, I would like to focus in some work I have recently published, and that I will, I hope. Well, we all know that journalism as a profession was always studied under the umbrella of the news media, with journalists embedded within organizational and societal structures. And we all know that the new digital environment has definitely changed this scenario, right? So in traditional media, news professionals are expected to follow the norms and practices created and perpetuated in the field as a way of maintaining autonomy and professional authority. I think although journalism mostly operate within commercial structures, a cornerstone of that professional authority has been the separation between the editorial work of journalists and the commercial activities of the news organization, right? By contrast, social media spaces laid outside these institutional boundaries serving as spaces for connection, for interaction, publication, and also amplification for the parts of individual journalists. Still, platform companies are not NGOs. I mean, they are actually economic entities whose priority is not to serve democracy, it's not to serve public good, and we have seen that, is to make money. Also, social media platforms were not conceived to be used only by journalists. They actually existed before we as journalists arrived, and journalists have permanently negotiated working with norms and expected behaviors unique to these sort of rules of the games of these news media spaces. So the results on getting into social media has been then a sort of a constant effort of balancing norms and practices from the traditional professional side with those of social media platforms to gain this symbolic and cultural power they need in order to be more visible, right? Starting from there, sorry, a little bit cold. It's possible to deduce that professional norms are not necessarily the same across all media logics and do not translate into the same role performances. This, of course, doesn't necessarily mean that the roles that journalists that we know already and that they perform in offline media cannot be actually present in social media spaces. I mean, of course they are, but it implies that journalists are developing new ways to perform these identities as professionals and persona. I mean, just as an example, while in traditional media, the journalist reports on a story, on social media platforms, they can be also part of that story and becoming a topic themselves. Different studies show that the way in which journalists negotiate their roles and identities on social media actually offer important insights into how they position themselves in this new digital public sphere. Overall, the results of several studies I have conducted with my team show that journalists incorporate social media platforms such as Twitter or Instagram into their everyday work in very, very different ways, and that social media platforms under the construction or render the construction actually of different but not necessarily mutually exclusive digital selves through the overlapping and in some cases merging of their professional, organizational, and personal identities, as well as in the appearance of new journalistic roles. So look, given that I think social media are spaces that cross the boundaries of the personal and the professional, as well as the public and the private, my team and I have been profoundly interested in analyzing the journalists' ongoing struggle to maintain the status of the profession, but at the same time to develop their individual reputation and cultural capital through the use of these digital platforms. And I can see the audience today, and I know that we all know that a great deal of research have focused on digital news platforms and how traditional media have adopted social media in their newsroom. But for today, I'm more interested in discussing how journalists use social media platform and its impact on their role at the individual level. And particularly, I would like to take Chilean journalism as example, examining how journalists engage, contest, and also diverge from different norms and practices of traditional journalism. During the past few years, my colleagues and I, Alfred Hermida, and other great Latin American scholars, Amaranta Alfaro, Patricio Cabello, and Auska Obando as well, have worked very close to me to understand how journalists negotiate their identities specifically on Twitter and Instagram. Our proposed conceptual models draw from field theory, social interaction theory, and studies on journalistic identities and role performance, analyzing, as I said before, how they construct and deconstruct these identities from serving the public good to taking on commercial activities for personal gain, for example. So to do that, we have relied on mixed methods, conducting a large content analysis of social media profiles and also of social media posts from Chilean journalists. We have also conducted an important number of in-depth interviews with journalists, as well as digital ethnography work, which is something very new to me in my career as a researcher, and I have found profoundly interesting. Now, there are at least three main aspects important for me to understand or that you can understand our rationale, and also important to understand the way we frame the study of journalistic identity and performance in social media platforms. The first, as you can see in the slide, is related to the specific spaces in which different type of capitals can be negotiated. In social media, all of us can engage every day in front stage and backstage performances in any given situation. So it's possible to argue that this rigid front stage and public presentation of the self associated more with traditional media is transformed into a more layered embodiment of social media, right? The second aspect is about the level of analysis we can use to observe this phenomenon. In traditional journalism, we define journalistic performance as the collective outcome of specific newsroom decisions. And we have published a lot about this with the Journalistic Role Performance Project. Now, in social media, the institutional platform is not the same, because journalists are able to open accounts and post on them as if those accounts were actually their own media outlets, and people follow them, right, rather than the media. Now, the difference between these two levels of analysis are significantly relevant in that the main subject of analysis is not the news outlet anymore, but the individual journalist accounts on social media. Of course, the boundaries between the public and the private and the professional or the personal are far more blurred on social media than on the institutional spaces of news organizations. And for journalists, this can take the form of simultaneously sharing their professional work and also branding themselves as a way of sort of self-commodification that seeks to increase their market value. We can clearly observe that the personal and the professional are not exclusive positions on social media. They actually exist as permanent co-identities that shape both sides of their persona in their posts that they actually share with the audience, right? Now, finally, the third aspect that I would like to refer to highlights the influences of internal and external forces in journalistic performance. In legacy media, the journalist's work mostly depends on endogenous and institutionalized forces, such as their news media organization and the societal level in which they are immersed. But in social media, journalists can also be influenced directly by other external forces. Individuals, for example, can decide whether or not to follow journalists and like or comment on their post. In the same way, advertisers can actually bypass the publisher and look to the journalist as a social media influencer who will endorse or advertise products or services. And as you know, those endorsements has become quite common. A common way to link a brand with an individual profile's image and reputation. In a very recent work, we will be actually, I think it should be published in Digital Journalism during these days. We suggest with my colleague Alfred Armida that while at the news organization level, it's possible to see a blurring between commercial and professional forces, at the journalist level, the blurring has become a merging of the personal and the professional context in relation to both, to media organization and advertisers. For journalists, this implies a sort of degree of complexity, right? And mutability in this interplay between their identities and these forces that impact journalistic norms and at the same time, journalistic practices. So in our work, we analyze first a spectrum of performance, as you can see on the slide, by journalists from narrowly professional action to much more personal actions on social media. On the one hand, a journalist may may make a conscious decision to act in a strictly professional manner, limiting their social media activities just to those prescribed by their position in a news organization. But on the other hand, journalists may also use unconscious self-expressions from a more personal perspective to provide more details on who they are as people, as human beings, and sharing their experiences of everyday life. Secondly, we analyze the forces that influence the journalistic performance on social media, acknowledging that journalists operate within forces stemming from organizational structures of media publishers, as well as from the rise of the influencer economy on digital platforms. Now, all the examples and the data I'm gonna show you today are from Chilean journalists from different type of national media platforms, including anchors, presenters, and also reporters. These journalists cover different bits, and they have varied levels of experience and also play a different range of roles in their newsrooms. Of course, they have different levels of popularity on their social media accounts. I'm not really sure if you are familiar with Chilean journalists. I assume that most of you are not. So just as a brief intro, I can tell you that more than 95% of Chilean journalists, news professionals are attended to journalism schools, which means that they got a bachelor in journalism and communication. That is something very cultural in Latin America, schools of thought in terms of who should be actually practicing the profession. They are also very connected to the digital world. I mean, a recent study that we actually make here in Chile found that 9 out of 10 journalists who work for Chilean national media outlets have an active account on Twitter and Instagram, and that 8 out of 10 have active accounts on both, which suggests a high level of penetration among members of this professional group, which is even higher than figures reported in previous studies conducted in other Latin American countries, and actually pretty similar to the rate of social media use by journalists working in most developed countries. What we have done is we have studied more than 800 journalist profiles, more than 7,000 posts from 25 specific journalists' accounts, and interviewed dozens of them. Today, I will show you some of that data. But I thought, and I was talking about this with Oscar before you joined us, that while you can find most of the figures, the statistical figures in a journal article, it was maybe more interesting to illustrate through some specific examples most of what we have found. Okay. So going back to our model. So to show our model in action, we may consider these 4 scenarios which illustrate our conceptual framework on journalistic identity and performance on social media platforms. So let's take the common scenario where a journalist shares a post that is professional in nature and it relates to their own media organization, right? So the content may promote their individual journalistic work or that of their colleagues. For example, journalists may publish a photo of their work in the newsroom and comment on a link or piece that they produce for the media organization where they work, right? In a second scenario, right, the journalist shifts to a more personal identity, but within the professional context of the media publisher. And this kind of performance is generally seen in what we call it manufactured backstage. Journalists may share photos or videos of themselves before they got on the air, and sort of offering to audience a peek behind news production. In another case, they may also share videos of themselves working in their newsrooms or preparing the stage for their reporting, etc. So, but here, the professional and personal blur, we can see that but still take place under the overarching umbrella of the news media organization. In both cases, right, going back to the model, the professional and the personal are able to sort of operate subject to internal institutional forces coming from their media organization and the related norms and expectations of being a professional journalist. These scenarios, let's say, could fall under the top half of our model and I would say contribute to how journalistic identity has tended to be constructed on social media. However, what we suggest is that the bottom of our model contribute to the deconstruction of established identities and role performances as here, the professional and personal contexts of the journalists are under the umbrella of the external commercial forces that we call the product, which is related more with advertisers and commercial activities. So let's take two scenarios where the product, rather than the publisher, serves to shape journalistic identity. For example, when journalists interact with the product in a professional context. So in such scenario, the social media content has the trapping of the news organization, right? Such as the newsrooms, as you can see on the images. While the journalist takes on the role of social media influencer, it's still clearly identified as a media professional. And I intentionally use these profiles of two news anchors from Chile. One of them is Soledad Oneto, a journalist that actually used to have the highest level of credibility in the country. And Jose Antonio Neme, which is another famous journalist that moves quite a lot on these two spaces. So we can see here that they post a photo of them in the studio, decided to showcase their look of the day, and including an expression of gratitude to the fashion designer or some specific brand that they mention. Unfortunately, it's in Spanish, but that's why I'm just describing what happens. So in these cases, the journalist is leveraging association with an organizational media for commercial purposes. In some ways, this can be seen as a reconfiguration of practices in lifestyle media, where free products or travel or money are provided in exchange for a mention in a feature. Fourth and final scenario lies at the intersection of the personal and the product. So here, details and images of personal activities that occur outside their formal job are presented side by side with services and product. For example, a journalist may share a promotional post endorsing a car or other product or service. In these slides, we can see how Jose Manuel de Tesanos used here a placement strategy to promote Adidas. Well, he's a sport journalist, by the way. But in all the cases I'm showing you, the journalists are explicitly trading on the personal admiration of fans for commercial gain. And whether explicit or not, such behaviors actually associate the journalist's social and cultural capital with economic capital outside of the institutional structure of the media, and clearly push the boundaries of professional norms and standards of journalism. Now, I would like to move to another study we have recently published in Social Media and Society, and to exemplify what I have just shown you on three roles that we have seen as persistently present in the performance of journalists in social media, which are the promoter, the celebrity, and the joker role. These roles are, of course, not new. And they actually have been largely analyzed in other fields, such as promotional culture, celebrity studies, marketing, or human research. But what is interesting here is to analyze how the performance directly connect with the merging of the personal and the professional and the public and the private phases of journalists in action that we were talking before, as well as how the blurring of the editorial and commercial decisions at the individual level of the journalist may impact the profession. Also, although these three roles may currently seem very peripheral from a professional perspective and are more loosely connected to traditional journalistic norms, their study is important as they are already being performed by journalists on social media at different levels. Okay, so let's start with the promoter role. In digital journalism, scholars have already found that different presentation of the selves can actually be related to different type of promotions of the self. In our operationalization of this role, we propose distinguishing between several indicators. Some of these indicators are linked to the relationship between the journalist and their news media organization, right? More than the publisher side, while others refer to the relationship between the journalist and the product or service through which they do a third-party promotion, which is more the product side. Let's see some examples. So in this post, we can see how, for example, a very, very famous journalist we have here in Chile, Mónica Rincón, performed professional branding, advertising her news TV show on CNN, Chile, while the other three posts refer to the promotion that other journalists do about specific product. Soledad Oneto, again, doesn't show the name of the shoe brand, but tag the brand in the text that she wrote. Catalina Edwards on the other side and Jose Manuel de Tesanos, they explicitly advertised the use of Usering and the new FIFA 21 video game. In terms of the celebrity role, our analysis have also shown that the celebrity role can be materialized in the performance of journalists through specific indicators. There are, for example, some characteristic of reflected fame materialized when journalists repost about themselves through retweets or shares or screenshot of material published by others, or when they use elements of fame by association. A future indicator of a celebrity role is the trapping of fame, when a journalist perform activities that suggest they are enjoying the lifestyle of the rich and famous people. Of course, I think journalists also need to demonstrate that they are just like everyone else, and that they do the same things that the followers do, right? To get this approach and connection. So they can post about their everyday life settings, including images of themselves going to the gym or waiting in traffic, etc. And in relation to this notion of celebrity is also this idea of, and we have found this idea of using a personal branded hashtag based on their names or nicknames or any other signature characteristic that create a sort of synthetic personalization. So let's look at our examples here. On these examples, we can see that several of the indicators of the celebrity performance are in action. For example, Mónica Rincón again reposts an interview that a newspaper did to her, and Jose Manuel de Tesanos, a very funny guy, posed a photo that reflected fame by association, picturing himself with Lionel Messi and showing us that he knew him since he was not even that famous. We can also see here Soledad Oneto, who remembers how much she enjoyed a very, very fancy life when she was one of the presenters of the most important music festival from Latin America. Lastly, the joker role. So this is very interesting. Transversal to these two roles is humor, right? And this potential development of a sort of role that journalists can implement at the same time that they promote themselves or they become celebrity stars. This is, of course, not the only mission of this role. I mean, several journalists perform the Joker role to, I think not only journalists, I mean, it could be done by everyone, just to push the boundaries of humor by engaging in practices such as poking fun at authorities or stating the truth, challenging social norms, all while being seen as daft. At the journalistic level, this role can be present on social media when journalists use humor while commenting, right, on their work or their colleagues or sources, or when they post ridiculous videos or images of themselves outside of a work context. I mean, they can try to be funny, they can try to make jokes or laugh at or with others in their posts, right? Here in Chile, one of the journalists that actually mastered the performance of this role is Jose Manuel de Tesanos again. So if you just check his profile on Instagram, you will see that he includes elements of the Joker role in most of his posts, especially in that social media platform. For example, we can see here that he's pretending leaving home without pants, or being ironic about the lack of cleaning products during the COVID pandemic period in 2020, and how people have taken all these products in the supermarket, leaving nothing for others. We can also see here Felipe Delgado, which is a radio journalist who used Twitter to laugh at a colleague, who laughed at a TV journalist who just, I think it was a year ago, made that terrible mistake on air when covering a story, and et cetera, et cetera. So looking at how different journalists perform on social media on any single day, on any random day, may reveal different potential and non-mutually exclusive realities, right? So checking out some statistics, we can see that from these three roles, the presence of the promoter is significantly higher than in journalistic performance on social media in Chile than the presence of the Joker, and especially than the presence of the celebrity role. Well, this is it's true that the presence of both, let's say the publisher-oriented and the product-oriented promoter roles are a bit higher in journalists on Instagram. What it really matters at the time of making a difference in its presence is the media type in which the journalists practice the profession. Especially in Chile, journalists working in television and radio seems to perform the promoter role significantly more than journalists working in print and online media. When referring to, according to, I can read this here in this slide, when referring to the product-oriented promoter role, instead it's only television journalists who stand on this present. Instead, the celebrity and the Joker role are mostly explained by the media platform, with both roles being performed significantly more on Instagram than on Twitter. In other words, while the promoter role seems to be more transversal across digital platforms, the Joker and the celebrity role are more emergent roles and closer to the media logic of Instagram than on Twitter. The journalistic popularity is significant in predicting the presence of the promoter and the celebrity role, but curiously not the Joker role, while the level of activity in media platforms by the journalists is only associated to the presence of the Joker role. Finally, the hierarchy in the presence of these three roles doesn't imply that they don't relate each other, right? So what I'm trying to say is not because you have a lot of promoter and not a lot of celebrity there, they don't go together, quite the contrary. I trust my image is not very cool actually, but I try my best. Well, what we found is that a significant and positive association between the celebrity and the joker role, and between the celebrity and the promoter role in its two variations. But nevertheless, we can also see a significant but negative association between the publisher-oriented promoter role and the joker. So there's potential combinations here on these associations that seems to show very interesting findings that we definitely need to analyze more in depth in the next couple of, I would say, days. I'm just dying to go more in depth. And I was just telling Oscar as well at the beginning, and I'm a bit frustrated because I actually promised him, and I was expecting to have the analysis of this data ready at this point. Unfortunately, the last couple of, I would say just the last year has been crazy because of COVID and very difficult within universities, especially here in Chile. So we should need a bit of more time. But I hope that you can find this in the near future in a good journal. And I hope that to get some insights from you to analyze this data more in depth. I mean, this is clearly just the beginning of our work, and we still need to answer so many pending questions. For example, and it's something that we state in our paper, there is much scope for research on how far media organizations are or are not aware of this range of digital selves presented by their editorial staff. For example, how far news media organizations will accept or condone journalists taking on influencer type identities, given this decline of traditional sources revenue and the corresponding precarious working condition and salaries in the industry. So in this sense, I think future studies need also to address how newsrooms and individual journalists and reporters navigate the shifts in power balance when news professionals have a substantial following on social media. I think in an environment which is privileged self-expression and self-promotion, it will be clearly relevant to learn if the media encourages journalists to make themselves, and as a consequence, their employers as well, in order and to market themselves and the employer in order to get more traffics and more clicks. Also, it will be interesting to know whether or not it's possible for journalists to combine, and this is something that it really matters for me, to combine this commercial and professional context without risking journalistic credibility and professional authority. I think it's important to consider how far journalists engaging in influencer activities on social media, and I think I just took note of something that I wanted to read to you. So how far journalists engaging in these influencer activities on social media are developing, as Matt Carlson highlights in a previous book, new normative underpinnings justifying these practices to the point of redefining what constitutes the field of journalism. I think that's a discussion that definitely points to this broader issue of the deinstitutionalization of journalism that we need to definitely take care of. So thank you very much for attending to this presentation, and I'm very open to reply all the questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Claudia. That was a great presentation. I personally really enjoyed it, and hope that we will be receiving some questions and comments here. should I interpret it as Maya wanting to raise her hand? If I'm not sure, but Raul has raised the first question in the chat. Maybe you want to take the floor, Raul.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Claudia. Thanks for a great presentation. Really, really interesting. What I wrote in the chat, it's basically that I take that this type of influencer / celebrity journalists are the vast minority, right? Like there cannot be a lot of journalists that are being paid by Adidas to advertise their brand. So yeah. My question would be, how does this scale to the vast majority of anonymous journalists, and whether they see this as a okay practice, or if they resent and they think like, well, maybe they shouldn't be doing that? How do you know? Because maybe this is something that it's not been, like you haven't studied, but do you know whether this is something, an aspirational thing for other journalists, or this is something that they don't consider to be okay?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I got the question. Yeah, it's a mix of things here. I will try to address it. Can you hear me? I can see you. You're frozen.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm sorry, but I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, great. So yes, first of all, it's something that was a methodological decision that we took, right? To open the scope not only to famous journalists, the famous reporters. In our sample, we have included journalists with different level of popularity, and levels of activity. And it's true. Well, it's true that it's, of course, the minority of journalists who are performing this celebrity role. It is a minority because some of the indicators that are more, let's say, that discriminate more, like, let's say, when they do this fame by association, or when they remember all this luxury life, those are closer to a very minority group. But there are several other, type of indicators within the celebrity role that have this sort of a aspirational tone. And that's why I think that we need more in-depth research on this, because there's sort of a 2 or 3 sides of the celebrity role. One side that is more open to, for example, asymmetrical communication with the audience. That's more broad, for example. Just reposting about yourself. Those type of practices are much more, let's say, common in the sample that we took. And when we put all together, we can just see that. We just see the guys who do everything, and those are the minority. Now, that's one part. So I think we still need to go more in depth to reply that, but definitely, so, to know exactly which factors actually explain the celebrity role best, more at the individual level. Now, the more, let's say, ethical question, yes, there are a huge discussion. And we published a paper with Amaranta Alfaro in digital journalism, not exactly about the celebrity role, but they were discussing what is considered to be too good, too acceptable in social media or not. And we have these three approaches, right? The more skeptical to consider these networks as a professional space for interaction of the group, which is more adapted to this. They just navigate in the middle of of the ocean, and the other guys who are really more pro, and they just think that this is great, and they can do whatever they want, and they don't really care about what the others think. But actually, they really care. And what we actually found is that there is a profound, I would say, fear that they will be considered unprofessional on the one side. And on the other side, I will say there is a sort of, I don't want to say envy, but a sort of inconsistency in their answers. Because on the one side, they say, no, they cannot do that. I mean, they cannot use the media platforms and the studio to promote, brands and services. But on the other side, they aspire to. All the guys or journalists who actually say that that's not a good practice is because they don't really have the possibilities to do that, And so I think that they are not, that the answers are not very consistent at the end, and and this is something very situational, and it may change. And what I can see is that if the audience, if the or news organizations are accepting that these big figures of, that, as I said in my presentation, people that used to have the highest credibility as a journalist in the country are promoting products and services openly in their networks, is because something is changing, not only within journalism, something is changing with the audience as well, right? And the other part of this is that maybe it could help to illuminate future research, is that, journalists are super smart. So they just target their platforms. They don't use it in the same way. This woman that I was showing you in the presentation, who is really selling everything on Instagram, is a political animal on Twitter. And she was very carefully and to create this, let's say, 2 editorial lines. And if you check Soledad Oneto account on Twitter and on Instagram, it's just to check 2 different human beings. And she was able to do that, And that's a practice that not everyone is doing, of course, but maybe it could help to illuminate how this works. I don't know, by the way, how this work in Nordic countries. I know more about Spain, and it's not too different, to what is happening in Chile. The difference is that Spain have a bigger market, so it's even easier for them to do what the Chilean journalists in a 18 million people population are doing.
Right.
So.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. I think Stan raised his hand first, and then we have also a question after that from Maya.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia, for a very fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed this. And of course, I had kind of the same question as Raul, because I was also fascinated to see this promoter role and this kind of activity that would, in many other journalistic cultures, mean you would lose your job, basically, if you did stuff like that. But I have another question, which is slightly different, but touches on the same thing, because I guess a lot of these news organizations that you have studied, they also have some kind of sort of media codes of conduct or something stating rules and regulations on how their journalists should perform or act on social media. And could you say something about that and how these roles relate to any such codes of conduct on social media that news organizations might have? And whether or not, for instance, those such codes of conduct encourages personal behaviors, so that things that might look as if they're personal behaviors and the journalists acting as backstage persons might in fact be more institutionalized professional behavior encouraged by the news organizations themselves, if you get my question.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. Yes, and most of this information, actually, we got it in our more qualitative, research, right? Because it's very difficult to get into news organizations, and especially in Chile, because there's no regulation. It's very difficult to get info directly or public information about this ethical rules or code of conduct of newsrooms. But we know for sure, because we interview a very important group of journalists working in these newsrooms, that some of them, well, let's say 15 years ago, everything was, no, you cannot post anything, you cannot do anything, basically, that you cannot use the word of our media. You cannot say that you're a journalist from our media. And people were just more, let's say, they have this fear that maybe politicians or the advertisers were going to say something, right? But that was very long time ago. Now things have changed, and some networks, especially television networks in Chile, are actually preparing. They are training journalists to, use social media platforms to promote themselves and to promote the media, which is something different. So that is just they jump. There's this jump from one situation to another, because now they thought, well, this is maybe unstoppable. These guys are very famous or are getting a lot of followings, so we cannot just fire them because they attract a lot of clicks and popularity to our media. And what we need to do now maybe is to just join them and, be happy, the two of us, let's say, in a way. So yes, some of them have said that they have been trained them formally. Others say, no, there is nothing formal, but that we are encouraged to promote our media. And there is, I would say, a blind spot or sort of a space for imagination in which they haven't been alert that you cannot use this studio for this or that. I assume, but that's something that we don't know yet, that this exchange of products, services, and money that journalists are having with some brands can be even negotiated at the organizational level at some point. You know what I mean? So the organization may know that they are doing this, and they say, okay, you can do that, but this must be, I don't know, 50-50. Or if you are, attracting this for the organization, we need to get some money from that too. Which is a very, I would say, tricky situation, because it puts the journalist in a situation that is changing one master from another master. So he more autonomy, internal autonomy, but it doesn't have any autonomy from the outside, because of the publishers and the advertisers. I don't know if I got your question, but that's what I can say about it. And also, I think that all this creation of cultural social capital that journalists are getting through social media is fascinating, because it is changing the way, it's changing the position of the journalists in this public, digital public sphere. And I think that the media is thinking, it must be, or should be thinking of how to deal with this, because of their survival, but also because of how can we protect the authority of the profession, right? I hope that it's a good answer for you.
Thanks, Claudia. The questions are lining up, so there's great interest in your talk and hearing what more you have to say. So Maya, Anna, and Afshin have comments, and let's begin with Maya, raising questions relating to very timely topics of online harassment, and if I may say, the work you're familiar with, mob censorship by Vice Board, etc. And perhaps among journalists in other genres than sports and live anchors, where perhaps visibility on social media is not something you desire. Maybe Maya wants to take the word and
Thanks,
expand.
Oscar. Thank you, Claudia. I'm actually doing a related piece of research, so I'm finding your work to be very, very valuable. I'm doing research on British journalists on the beat of politics, and I'm currently in the data collection. And I'm focusing in particular on the emotional labor that journalists what emotions they experience and how they manage them when they're working with social media. And the reason why I'm asking is because kind of preliminary findings are that the emotions that British journalists associate with, posting or engaging with social media are dread and anxiety and anger and frustration, and even those whose profiles, when you analyze, you can see that they're promoting their work, they're, active on the outside. There is huge emotional toll that, goes into consequences in their private life and in their professional life. We have quite a lot of journalists in the UK who are leaving journalism because they feel they have to perform on social media, but there is too much emotional toll related to it. I've noticed at one point you've mentioned fear and envy. So I'm just wondering whether when you spoke to journalists in Chile, did they talk about how work with social media makes them feel, and particularly with regards to the, at least in Europe, quite a lot of abuse that the journalists receive on social media?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I still remember that one of these journalists mentioned that the beauty and the beast, and he was referring to the Twitter as the beast and the beauty as the journal, as the Instagram, because yes, they make a clear sense, especially the ones who are not the, what we call it, the redefiners, the 24/7, the guys that said, well, you know, we know that this is tough. We know that these people are fighting, that they are going to say things to us. We don't care, you know, or, I mean, I'm going to protect myself. So, but they know what is going to happen. They are aware of that and they accept it. We found that there is a specific group of people. I assume that because what they are gaining, you know, in return is worth it. I mean, it's, you know, it makes sense to them. But the biggest group or majority are in the middle, and they mentioned it several times that it was very virulent, and there was a lot of aggressivity, and that they need to block a lot of followers because they are not, they say, I'm not being paid for this. I'm not being paid to be, you know, I don't know, verbally abused, or just, you know, to get all this bad energy or aggressivity or threats sometimes. But that type of things, well, have happened in I would say different ways, because on Instagram, what we have found, not only on the interviews, only reading the comments, is that sometimes are, you know, the same audience who are, you know, saying, asking, or criticizing the journalists because they are, I don't know, selling things. You know, that's very interesting that they realize, or because of political motives, basically, you know, because they know that that journalist is from just sympathize with a political angle or political party or whatever, or something's happening in the country. But in Twitter, it's just, you know, they said it's a violent space, and some of them decide only to you know, to block the comment part, so they cannot get things, or and maybe because of that, it's something that they didn't mention in my presentation, and I will, maybe I can send you that report that we wrote recently in English, but it hasn't been published. Is how they react with their, not only their posts, but their accounts, the profiles, how they protect from the profiles. So we just found a significant relationship between those guys who reported that they got violence and very bad, you know, vibes from people, and they do not mention that they work in a specific media in their profiles. They do not post any picture related to the media in their profiles. So they just try to get detached, or they create this sort of a semi-public private space. So they make their accounts private, and they accept people. They create this, you know, meso space. Ori, I think there was this, how's the name, the paper of Ori, Oscar, about these meso spaces, this conceptual paper.
How about it?
Yes, well, because he mentioned that, and I just came to my mind, because it's exactly what these guys in Chile said, that they want to share with an audience, but they don't want to share with all of them. So they select their audience. So they just, you know, they just make it private, and then they can just, you know, behave and interact with them. But they are not, you know, they are willing to accept all this emotional, as you say, labor that they need to spend. And it came several times. I'm not being paid. They said, I'm not being paid. My news organization to go through this, to go through, have a bad time. And some of them have even closed their accounts for a while. That type of thing. So it's clearly something that they have in mind, but clearly more on Twitter than on Instagram. And just to finish with my answer, I think that now is Twitter and Instagram, but tomorrow is going to be another social media platforms, and then another one. So it's not exactly this. I think what it matters most is to see the logic of these platforms, and how we can learn from there, because now we have TikTok. I never thought in my life that TikTok was going to be something relevant in journalism, really. And now I just shut my mouth, because I know that even media are using it, and journalists as well, and I know what's going to happen. I mean, the world is crazy. And then it's going to be another one and another one, and things can be, similar or not. We don't know yet.
Thanks, Claudia.
Thanks a lot, Claudia. We are overdue in time, and we try to keep it to 1 hour sharp. So we have one comment from Anna, and more of a commentary from Afshin. But I would like us to say we formally end now, and then perhaps if Claudia want to respond to Anna's comment, and for those who want to stay, please do so. But if you have scheduled other things, we fully understand if you need to leave. We will be closing within shortly. But yeah, Claudia, if you want to briefly respond to Anna's, that would be great.
Oscar, can I just maybe voice it up? Yeah, hi, Claudia. I just want to say thanks once again. It's always a pleasure to see you, to hear from you. I don't want to keep too much time, but I just want to, my question was about the non-mainstream journalism. So whether you think these roles you identified are applicable to the ethnic journalism, to non-mainstream journalism, to some minority journalism and media. So whether, if you have any thoughts or insights about that, that would be great. Thanks again. It's a pleasure to hear from you always.
Hi, Anna. Yes, well, I have two students actually doing a thesis on this, exactly on this, not ethnic, but minority and local media. And what we have, so journalists that are not really well known in the country, like they don't have a lot of popularity. And yes, what we have found is that the Joker role, because it's clearly connected to the political side, it just show up a lot. So these guys are really funny, but they're using it to speak up, using it to just put the time over the table. So that role, and also the promoter role, but more the published side, right? The published side of the promoter role is quite transversal, and the Joker and the celebrities is what we have found in their studies is that the celebrity doesn't show up. Now, what it will be interesting, and we have the data, but we haven't, I couldn't analyze it. I feel terrible about it. It's how these three, let's say, emergent in social media for journalists only, doesn't mean that they are emergent roles, relate to the more traditional ones. So I couldn't finish the analysis, but there seems to be a clear relationship between the journalistic voice, the more interventionist side of a journalist, and some of these roles as well. And discussing about future research, I see that what you say, it's very interesting how the use of some of these not very professional or traditional roles can be used for good reasons in some spaces, like minorities. Some stuff that cannot be said in some political systems that have some regulations, but the journalists turn the discourse around and use these roles to just speak up and say what they want to say and to defend some causes. So yes, we have that data, at least from Chile. Now I'm a very prone to do comparative research. So this is, I think, one of my first times that I have just presented on one country, and I feel a bit weird, but uncomfortable, because I would like to immediately compare. But at least of what we have seen with Alfred, just, you know, taking some cases from the England, United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States, and Chile, which are very different countries, you know, overall, the situation is not very different, you know, so this is something global. It doesn't seem to be, but if you go and see, this is happening everywhere, more or less, you know, so that will be my answer. Good to see you too.
Thanks, Claudia.
Thank you, Claudia. With that, I think we will finish for the day. We have made a recording, and I will discuss with Claudia. I will send a recording to her, and then we'll see if we may share it in other ways at this point. For now, we're not allowed to publish the video recordings unless we have subtitles in Norwegian, and currently we don't have a technological actant that can help us with that in a professional way. But we hope to be able to do so in the future, and then we can relive this experience of listening to Claudia. But thanks for today, and I totally recommend the publications she has published, and there is, of course, a new model in the works. That should be out any day now. That should be great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, you all. Thank you. Bye, Oscar. Bye, all. Bye.
Bye-bye.